Good afternoon, everyone. It is great to see so many people who are joining in this important conversation on voting rights. As many of you know, we live in a country in which there's a constitution, which, notwithstanding the 15th Amendment or the 26th Amendment or the 19th Amendment, there's not an affirmative right to vote. And we have seen over the years all manner of efforts to take the franchise away from those who sacrificed so much to hold on to it, including the namesake of this conference, that is to say, William Monroe Trotter, who dedicated so much of his life to secure the franchise, the right to vote for Black people. So this conversation on voting rights takes place at a pivotal moment. On Monday, Stacey Abrams has led a fight to protect the right to vote in Georgia. A trial begins on voting rights that is critically important on Monday. On yesterday, on the 150th birthday of William Monroe Trotter, Ketanji Brown Jackson was elevated to the United States Supreme Court. These are momentous times. And so I can't think of a more important conversation or a better person to lead it than an extraordinary journalist and a friend of the work of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice in the person of Fredricka Whitfield. Now, so many of you know her and watch her on a regular basis. All that being said, it bears repeating for those of you who know her less, her wonderful background. She is an anchor for CNN US, based in the network's headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, where so many of the nation's voting rights fights are taking place. She anchors the weekend edition of CNN Newsroom, and she's an award-winning she's led a award-winning broadcast career that spans more than 30 years. That is absolutely hard to believe. She must have began as a precocious child. Whitfield's reporting ranges from covering stories from the Cuban-Haitian refugee crisis in the 90s to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. She's garnered multiple awards and honors for broadcasting, including the 2005 George Peabody Award for the network's live coverage of Hurricane Katrina and the aftermath, as well as a 2007 Emmy Award for outstanding live coverage of breaking news. Colleagues, friends, it is an absolute joy to welcome Fredricka Whitfield, who's been such a great friend and a colleague in this work of covering these kinds of issues. So with that said, Fredricka, thank you for doing this, and welcome to this panel.
Thank you, Professor Brooks. I'm so pleased to be here, and we know this is an incredibly vital topic, particularly at this time, and we will be delving into the voting rights of Americans, and we know that this impacts every one of the 133 million Americans who voted in the last general election, and don't we all hope that voter participation is even higher this midterm and the next general election. Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. You now have an idea of who I am. Let me now introduce our distinguished panel here, and I am going to shorten their titles, not because their credentials are unimportant, but because they are long and distinguished. And of course, all of you in the audience can read up on their backgrounds a little bit later after this discussion. So here we are with the abbreviated titles. Archon Fung, a Winthrop Laughlin McCormick Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. He also co-directs the Transparency Policy Project. Dr. Carol Anderson, Charles Howard Candler Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Emory University, and formerly a member of the U.S. State Department's Historical Advisory Committee. Hamilton Brooks, a senior at New York University studying history and sociology. He is the youth organizer and national strategic campaign manager of Generation Vote, a youth-led organization. Yael Bromberg, Chief Counsel and Strategic Advisor for the Andrew Goodman Foundation, spanning 25 states dedicated to making youth votes and voices a powerful force. She's also a constitutional rights attorney. Thanks for all of you being available and talking this afternoon. So let's begin with this very simple question, but promising very complex answers. So for whom will voting be most difficult this midterm election? Archon, you first.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much for Fredricka and Cornell and everyone else who helped organize this wonderful conference today. I think it's a great question. And if I could take just a couple of minutes, I think voting will be difficult for people, especially living in parts of the country where voting rights are being restricted. So I think there's a big geographic element, and then there is, of course, a large demographic element to it as well. The traditional communities who have found it difficult to vote will, some of them find it more difficult to vote, but there are also bright spots. There are many states that are making voting more accessible to people. If I could, I wanted to take just a couple of minutes. I kind of think of voting rights as fundamental, but kind of a gateway to milestone to a more important, more fundamental steps to a real democracy. I do not think of voting rights as the be all end all of democracy. I think right now there are three really different kinds of challenges to American democracy. And I encourage everybody who's interested in voting rights to think about all three of those challenges. One is the January 6th challenge, right? If January 6th had worked, voting rights would be not that relevant for a whole lot of people, not just traditionally people who've been historically disenfranchised, but lots and lots of people, because an election would have been unsuccessful. So that's the first level, is how do we keep having elections, which we hadn't had to think about for a long time, but I think we really need to think about that now. The second level is about voting rights. How do we make our very flawed democracy somewhat less flawed? And what are the tactical things that we can do to keep it from getting more flawed? And ensuring voting rights and the dignity and respect that goes along with that is important. Independent redistricting is important. Many, many tactical moves, but those won't really get us to a real democracy in which government is responsive to the people and everyone participates and people have political opportunities. For that higher level, we need to do a number of things that are actually impossible in the short term, but necessary in the long term. And this requires dealing with the very substantial malapportionment in Congress. You know, right now, the most populous state is about 180 times more populous than the least populous, but each of them gets 2 senators. The Electoral College is an institution that nobody outside of the United States even understands, and it's hard to explain it to them. So we have a rickety constitution that is preventing majority rule, and things like voting rights. Everybody who fights for voting rights needs to fight harder for voting rights, but needs to take on these struggles that are impossible in the short term, but necessary in the long term. I just want to end by saying that in 1950, getting voting rights for African Americans in the South was one of these tasks that was impossible in the short term, but absolutely necessary for the survival and thriving of American democracy in the longer term. And so right now, it's not that. It's a matter of preservation and expansion. But you don't have to look back many years for people who really fought hard for democracy, taking on these challenges that just seemed insurmountable, but worked really, really hard over many years to create the democracy that we can believe in.
So then, Dr. Anderson, perhaps by extension of one of the points that Archon was making and asking the question of how do we as a nation ensure voting rights, especially when you have now 19 states that have enacted voting restrictions in 2021, and this happening in mostly Republican-led legislatures, now leading to 34 laws. So I wonder, Dr. Anderson, how did we even get here?
Like Graham Central Station said, it wasn't on our own. How we got here was frankly, through the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy coming out of really the late 1950s, 1960s was about moving the Southern Democrats, those folks who had been ardently opposed to Black folks' civil rights, into the Republican Party. And so just as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65 had basically put the power of the federal government behind enforcing African-American civil rights, you had the party that had been discredited for their blocking of that being wooed into, welcomed into a legitimate Republican Party. They took that party over. The toxin of white supremacy took that party over and then added an aura of legitimacy that led us into the Shelby County v. Holder decision of 2013, that Supreme Court decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act, that gutted pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act. And the moment that that was gutted, you had these Republican states just rushing to the doors to implement voter suppression laws, because what they were doing is that they were targeting the folks that they knew would not vote for them. So they targeted African Americans, they targeted Hispanics, they targeted indigenous people, they targeted Asian Americans, they targeted poor folk, they targeted the youth. And in those targeting from these policies that looked legitimate on their surface, that's part of what we have to understand. It always has this aura of legitimacy behind it, but all you have to do is pull back the veil and you see the little Wizard of Oz pulling on those little levers, really creating you see what's really happening behind the scenes there. So you hear we have to protect election integrity. We have to stop all of this massive rampant voter fraud. There's no massive rampant voter fraud. That has been documented over and over, but it becomes the mantra that then provides the cover for these laws like voter ID, for like massive voter roll purges, for shutting down polling stations in Black and poor communities, for a number of these laws that for absentee ballots, for reducing drop boxes, all of these things which are designed to give the aura of protecting election integrity, but are actually designed to prevent African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, poor folk, and young folk from accessing the ballot box. That's how we got here.
So Yael, I see you nodding your head, and just to kind of summarize what Dr. Anderson is saying, the consequence of what most proponents see as a hugely successful general election, the consequence now is you have a division of how it is interpreted. You have on one side an argument of voter suppression, while the other is talking about voter expansion. How do you see it?
I think that's right, and that there's just a false narrative being presented that that we have to compromise election security, and this vague notion of what public confidence in our electoral system means. So when these laws are being introduced, they're being introduced, and there's about three main reasons for them that are justifications. One is voter fraud, which has been very well established to be a myth. Actually, the 2020 Trump litigation, more than 100 times that myth was essentially an audit on the system, and it found that the system worked. That more than 100 times the court showed that actually there was no big lie, that the election was secure and safe. And federal agencies in the US, including under the Trump administration, acknowledged that this was a safe and secure election. Yesterday, I was speaking with the US Election Assistance Commissioner, Ben Hovland. He said this is the safest election he had ever seen in his career. And that's true, because we saw unprecedented voter turnout. We saw 17 million more people drive to the polls compared to the last presidential election. Young voters, first election in which the majority of voters under the age of 30 participated. And of course, as you note, Fredricka, the response to this is voter suppression, this notion that there's a myth of voter fraud, but that is just a false construction. It is just an anthem. It is a rally call. It's a dog whistle. And as I said earlier, what does it mean for us to have public confidence in our electoral system? When Crawford was decided by the United States Supreme Court, which was the first decision to uphold a photo ID requirement, unfortunately, based on very thin facts that were presented because it was a new concept then. And when Crawford was upheld, the courts were very persuaded by this idea of voter fraud, election integrity, protecting the public confidence in our elections. But I think that the 2020 election has proved that the public is confident in our electoral system. We had an essential audit through the judiciary. We had unprecedented voter turnout and participation. And so these ideas of why we're in a place now where 250 voter suppression laws were introduced or pre-filed immediately after the election, a 7 times higher rate in 43 states. Well, we know what that is. That's a response to voter turnout and a affirmation of our belief in democracy. And I think that the question now is, how do we continue that? And as you know, there are all these new voter suppression laws being introduced. And in the meantime, there's 71 active cases taking place right now in 21 states, as well as the District of Columbia, fighting against those laws.
So Hamilton, are young people confident about voting? Are they as engaged in the fight for voting rights as they are engaged, and we're seeing young people are very engaged in the climate crises, other issues of concern? Is it on equal footing, voting rights, climate, crises, social issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there's a bit of nuance to it in the sense that I think in terms of, I'm not going to argue, I'm a youth voting rights organizer. I'm not going to argue here that youth voting rights is a mass movement in the way that climate is, because it's just simply not. But also at the same time, I think it's really important to point out that young people really do care about elections, and young people are not apathetic to elections. This has been something that's been continuous throughout history. I mean, speaking very honestly, like, young people volunteer a lot more than the people who vote a lot more than we do. And then, we're also just more civically engaged. The young people are the people out there protesting more than any other age group. And so when you see those things together, the picture becomes more clear that young people are a group that are uniquely impacted by systemic and institutional processes that are put in place so that they're disinterested, that are trying to make them disinterested in voting. I mean, you think about the fact that out of all age groups, candidates are least likely to reach out to young people. You think about the fact that, in New York, where I'm going to school, like, the NYC BOE has done shockingly little in terms of voter engagement with high schoolers, in terms of really preparing them to vote in elections. I mean, we see the decline of civic education ever since young people were given the right to vote in the 70s. Like, as soon as that happened, civics education in classes went down and has gone down continuously. And so when you see those things all coming together, you get a group of young people who are really interested in all the issues that are on the ballot, but who aren't always voting. But we've seen, even in cases, even with all the suppression going on, that young people have voted, and voted significantly over the past few elections.
Mm. So that's interesting, Archon, because historically we talk about the 50s and the 60s, civil rights movement, voting rights led by young people. John Lewis, Andy Young, they were in their early 20s and some of them in their late teens, to Hamilton's point. And the young people today are still engaged. So then how do candidates, how does anyone get people of all ages equally engaged in the fight for voting rights, just like they might be for the climate crises, or either perhaps some social issues, the fight against inequities, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. There was a great political observer from a couple of decades ago who said that people fight really hard for the right to vote, but once they get the right to vote, they don't actually use it all that much, right? That really, it's the fervor and it's the disrespect associated with the inability to vote that drives, and rightly so, it's deeply disrespectful, that drives demands to get the vote. And with the leaders that you're talking about, I think that, I guess I would favor, there are many measures, right, that would get voters of all ages to turn out. I think an important one is to create parties and politics that people really are excited about. And I think the two-party system is a real disservice to that. People have all sorts of desires. The United States is one of the only two countries in the world with two effective parties. Everybody else had more. Imagine if you had, the Trump wing, but the non-Trump wing, and the AOC and Bernie wing, along with the Biden wing. If all those people had different parties, I believe it would really mobilize a lot more people to turn out, because they'd have somebody to vote for that they really believed in. I also am intrigued by a book that recently came out by my colleagues E.J. Dion and Miles Rappaport, suggesting universal civic duty voting. What if we adopted the Australia or the Brazil system, in which everybody had a duty to vote? So right now in the United States, even in this great year, right, 2020, of record voter turnout, our voting age population turnout was 65% of the voting age population. And even if you waved a wand and got rid of all this voter suppression, how much would that go up? Maybe 70%, maybe. But, looking comparatively, we're at the bottom of the barrel. We're about 30 out of 35, near the bottom of the list in terms of the proportion of our folks that turn out to even a general election, right? So I think we really need a lot of work to do there.
That's a big problem. So Yael, I recall hearing you say, people who are choosing not to vote or throwing in the towel are privileged. And this is not about black or white, but they are squandering a right that obviously was hard fought. Either they don't know it or they don't care. Can you elaborate on that thought?
Well, this was in response to actually a student asking me, my vote doesn't count. And so isn't it okay for me not to vote as a result of that? And so my response to that was, no. That's a response based on privilege, that you assume that your vote doesn't count, maybe because you have power elsewhere. And so you don't feel a direct repression. As Archon described, you've maybe got enfranchisement, got the right to vote, but you don't feel the need to go to the actual ballot box, or you're completely disillusioned and you're trying to create alternate systems elsewhere. Like, young people are increasingly independently minded. They're investing in startups and co-ops and new ways of living in a different way. And it's a matter of, how do we pull them into the system? And the fact of the matter is that their vote actually does matter. Look at what happened yesterday. We had a historic nomination onto the United States Supreme Court. Where did that come from? That came from Georgia, where 1 out of 5 voters was a youth voter, and they drove to the polls. Let me tell you, in Bard College is a liberal school 45 minutes north, blue Empire State, right? We fought for them to be able to have a polling place on campus. 70% of the students in the district, 70% of the voters in the district are students. Year after year, we fought and we secured their ability to have an on-campus polling location. That sent a chord throughout the state of New York. And yesterday, we heard news that the state of New York included in their budget a mandate which amended the state election law to require polling places to be put on college campuses. I did a survey of this. I found that only 50% of college campuses that I surveyed provided an on-campus polling location on election day. And that's a local measure that we can use. So we have to really think outside of the box, especially, the youth voters. They got enfranchised. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary year of the ratification of the 26th Amendment. And in many ways, we don't consider them a protected class, although I believe that they're a unifying class, because people across the spectrum, we all acknowledge that we were, God willing, young once, God willing, age, right? So it's a protected class. And there are so many ways in which we can invest in those voters. And the win in New York through organizing and advocacy and litigation, the win in Georgia that secured that through democracy, we were able to change our justice system. These are very concrete ways in which, and we have to continue to communicate this and celebrate our wins, because I believe that democracy begets democracy, and we have to continue. We can't have a fall off of 2020 just because we had an existential threat of authoritarianism, that voter turnout does not continue to be the norm. We've now modernized our systems. That can't only have been a temporary response to a pandemic. We have to keep up.
Dr. Anderson, you're in Georgia, and I saw you nodding a lot, so I'm just going to press go. Say what's on your mind.
It was the incredible organizing over the span of a decade. I mean, so this is part of what we have to see. Georgia flip. They went, wow, look what they did that year. No, this was over a decade of organizing, and it was multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational organizing, understanding the power of this democracy. And it was working with people to say, what do you want? And having people respond, you know, I want good schools. I want affordable health care. I want to have a hospital in my rural area. I mean, it was listening to those folks and then tying in the power of the vote and the power of our representation in order to meet the people's needs. And it was in the runoff election, the Senate runoff election in January of 2021, Black voter turnout was almost 92%. I mean, that is like phenomenal. But the response has been, whoo, did you see Black folks come out and vote? Oh my gosh, how do we stop this from happening again? So this is what I call that white rage, that backlash to African Americans' advancement towards their citizenship rights. And it's the policy backlash. So we see it in SB 202. We see it in the kinds of voter suppression laws that are happening around this nation. And we deal with it by saying, we cannot treat 2020 as if we just won the Super Bowl. We got a first down. We have got to keep fighting because these repressive measures, the threat of authoritarianism has not abated. What we see in these new laws is a twofold piece. One is to go after how do we lower the access to the ballot box for a range of folk. And the other one is how do we lower the guardrails of democracy that kept Trump from overturning the will of the people in 2020? So how do we lessen the power of the Secretary of State? How do we lessen the power of the certification of the vote? How do we determine who's certifying those votes so that they have the power to just erase what the electorate wanted? And so that's why we have to fully engage and continue to be engaged so that we can protect this democracy.
So in addition to those things, Hamilton, what are the young people saying? I mean, what are the young people saying about universal voting? What are they saying about online voting, or perhaps even other suggestions on how to make voting safe, if not infallible altogether, or safer?
Yeah, so I think Carol brought up a lot of really great points in terms of Georgia, and I think Georgia is a perfect example because there were really two things that I thought were really strong in terms of their advocacy over a decade, and it was that they were truly prepared, and they were truly prepared in a way that we really haven't necessarily seen in other areas. I mean, we think about the reaction to the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act failing, and sort of now all the attention shifting to the local level and state level. And it's like, no, that should have been there earlier. And then also the fact that comms the communication was centered towards young people. But sort of to the question around online voter registration in AVR, I think in terms of where the opinion is and the approval is, I think it's in a strong place. And I think young people are behind it. But I think we have to be really, really wary of the other side and people against these ideas putting money into it. I mean, bringing up New York recently in the last election voted on a number of measures which would have opened up access to the ballot. I mean, we're talking about pre-registration, online voter registration, automatic, and these ballot measures lost despite approval before being in favor. And this is because Democrats didn't really put much money into it. So we're in a position where there is approval, But we have the other side and people who are working really, really hard to shift that. And I think when voting rights is not necessarily a mass issue, these sort of misinformation campaigns can become extra, extra powerful.
Yeah, well, the misinformation campaigns have only become more emboldened, have they not? And I think it seemed foreign perhaps 2 general elections ago, and now it's become the norm. Yael, what's the arsenal against the misinformation campaigns that seem to be winning larger support, making it harder for a lot of people to vote, because it is what's helping to propel a lot of these new pieces of legislation, that perhaps that big voter turnout, that voter expansion was too much, and as opposed to it being an opportunity for more people to vote, especially during a pandemic.
I think the arsenal is more organizing and more conversations like these about the power that we have on the local level, statewide, and federal level. We can't wait for the Freedom to Vote Act to come out. I mean, we have to maintain the pressure, but we can't just be advocating and making phone calls there. We have to continue to do the local work, for the young people working with their county registrars to bring polling places on campuses. On the state level, ensuring student voter identification forms can be valid forms of ID. Hamilton talks about the failure of election day registration to pass. Do you know EDR did not pass in New York? It's still languishing in New Jersey. I mean, these are blue states, and election day registration is not an administrative burden. There's no administrative burden shown. You're simply doing your job, which you would do before the voter registration deadline. But now, because we have the availability of technology and the voter registration forms are not simply paper forms that you go and secure into like a physical filing cabinet, right? You can check your GPS online. You should be able to register to vote on the same day. That is secure. And by the way, these are measures that it's not just the Republican Party. We're talking about blue states here. On the local level, we can be doing a lot more. This does not have to be an adversarial process. And this is why I really love the lens that the youth vote specifically offers, because it's a unifying piece. When the amendment was ratified 50 years ago, it's the most recent voting rights amendment to be ratified in US history. And it's the quickest amendment overall to be ratified. Why? It passed the Senate unanimously, the House almost unanimously. President Nixon signed it into law. And what he said during his certification ceremony, President Nixon, he said that young people serve a high moral purpose because a nation always goes through ebbs and flows of idealism, and young people will be the check on that. So what does that mean? It means that young people are critical for the actual practice of democracy. And young people, we're not talking about partisanship there. And so this is something that we have to lay and hold accountable on the local, state, and federal level and across party lines. When I speak with Republican parents, they don't want their children to be disenfranchised. I really believe that this is a unifying notion if we talk about empowering youth. And I think that, I hope, maybe it's overly optimistic, but I hope that when we talk about youth and we look at, as was mentioned earlier, youth leadership, youth helped to write the story of America. It was our founders, right? Frederick Douglass, he was 21 years old. Alice Paul, all these people, they were young, right? They were young when they wrote the US Constitution, when they wrote new constitutions into our ratification process. And yet we continue to perpetuate this myth that young people are apathetic, that they're not engaged, but they continue to lead today just like they always have. And I really believe that we just have to focus there, invest there, and go beyond, try to work beyond partisanship. These are really cross-partisan issues that are just about democracy.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about what we think is next. And then I believe we are going to be able to open it up for questions from our audience. So Hamilton, not to put the weight on you and your generation, the younger generations, but what do you think the hope is on the fight for voting rights? How might the next generation, young people, take it to the next level?
I'm so excited you asked me that question. Thank you.
I'm excited to hear your reply.
But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that we can be doing. I mean, I I think about the way I thought about the voting space, with my grandparents, a lot of the discourse around voting rights was going on in barbershops, it was going on in salons, it was going on in community centers, it was going on in churches. And now I think about, you contrast that with today. And I think, unfortunately, something we need to do better on is a lot of that discourse is now, you can only get access to that discourse if you have a JSTOR subscription or, or you have a subscription to the Times. So I think it's like really important that moving forward, that especially in terms of youth voting rights, that it becomes a space that is not just youth who are in college, but it's young people who are outside of college. And we really start to center the conversation more so on young people of color who are not in college, because these are truly some of the most people, when you asked the first question about people most vulnerable to voter suppression, that was the group I was going to name, a young person of color who is not in college. And I think the other side of it is honestly the way that, youth voting rights is going about our communication with not just media, but the way that we promote ourselves on social media. I think other movements, other mass movements, I look at a group like Sunrise, for example, are doing a really great job of pushing over social media and understanding the landscapes that they're a part of and using that in order to absorb people into the movement so that you can get young people, a part of these campaigns. Because these voting rights organizations, they're doing the work and they have the campaigns, but we need the young people there, and we need to reach out to where they are in order to get these interested people involved and truly engaged.
Right. And like you said, like a variety of young people, they are not some monolithic being. So, Archon, America has its new justice in Ketanji Brown Jackson. So the U.S. Supreme Court is likely to still have the same, 6-3 leaning on voting legislation. But what, if anything, are you anticipating in the near term?
Well, I think on a bunch of these democracy issues, the Supreme Court is pretty kind of taking a knee, so to speak. So I think that at the court level, it's moving, as we see, to the state courts and state constitutions. And I think there's going to be a lot of action there. I think looking forward, the state that we're in is bad with regard to voting rights and even norms about voting. But I think just 5 or 10 years ago, if you'd asked most people in America, like 80% probably would have said, yeah, more Americans voting is a good thing, right? And that's changed now in not a good way. So it wasn't that long ago, right? Barely a blink. So how do you get back there? So the norm, and I think the bumper sticker that I'd like everyone to walk away with is, voters need to pick the politicians, not the other way around. And so mucking around with voting rights and accessibility and gerrymandering is politicians trying to pick their voters, which is backward in a democracy. And then the last thought is, I think people should be attentive to new threats on the horizon. January 6th was certainly one of those. I think Yael and Carol and Hamilton can talk a lot to this, I imagine. I think we're going to see more political violence in the months ahead. And we see that very clearly in the intimidation of election officials and on social media and their families being threatened. I think we need to just say, in America, we don't do that. We do not threaten public officials with intimidation. It doesn't matter what your views are, but physical threats and violence are off the table. And we just need to make a bright line there.
Well, then to that point, Dr. Anderson, it looks like you're about to say something. I wonder, how do you instill confidence in the voting public, or perhaps even politicians, to say, we're going to be able to vote without great bodily harm or risk? If the tone is now being set, as Archon was saying, that there's potentially more of that on the horizon, what can be done now to restore the confidence in people and the freedom to vote without facing violence potentially?
So I'm going to come at that through the other way. Right now, I see that our democracy is under a land, sea, and air attack. The land attack is the assault on voting rights. And we see this through all of the voter suppression laws. We see this through the lowering of the guardrails of democracy so that the certification can be done by those who have a vested interest in a certain outcome. The C attack is the washing away of the teaching of real American history, so that we see all of these anti-civil right, anti-CRT bills. All of these will not teach divisive topics. And so what that does is it creates an electorate that has no idea how we got here. And it creates an electorate that believes, and when I call the Rick Santorum School of History, that Europeans came to this empty land and built it all by themselves, which allows then for a framework of makers and takers. And so that Europeans were the ones who made the United States. Therefore, they're the only viable ones who have the access to the resources. Everybody else is a parasite on this society. When you see policy framed in that way, it's because you've got a myth history going on. And the air attack is the loosening of the gun laws that we have seen in multiple states, along with the concept that what we saw on January 6th, as the RNC said, was legitimate political discourse. And so when you make violence legitimate political discourse while you are loosening gun laws, it means that those whom you oppose politically are subject to that violence. Reuters did that incredible listing of the threats to election workers, where they were saying, hey, we're going to use our Second Amendment rights to take you out. What we need to see is the political backbone to say, we are not doing this. And there are consequences. One of the greatest threats to American democracy has been to allow white supremacy to run wild without being held accountable for the damage that it does to American democracy. We saw this in the founding of this nation when South Carolina was like, no, we are not arming Black folk. We would rather surrender to the British. We saw this when they were holding the Constitution hostage, saying we want to have the 3/5 clause or we will walk away. We want to have the fugitive slave clause or we will walk away. We saw this with the Civil War. We saw this during the Cold War, which was when the US was trying to do its strut around the world as the world's greatest leading democracy, but you're looking at Emmett Till, you're looking at Birmingham, and you can't make that make sense. And when there are no consequences, and right now we're looking at January 6th, the world was absolutely appalled and shocked when they saw those images about what was happening on the Capitol. Folks have to be held accountable. When we have accountability, consequences in the system, that is how you begin to reinstill confidence that our democracy will hold.
Yael, do you see that a new level of accountability on the horizon to break that cycle that she just described?
I wish I saw it more. I wish I could say that I see it, but I don't. I think that people are scared, and I think there's like a shell shock happening because it's just so hard. You know, during the Trump administration, every day was a new horror, right? Every day felt like a year. And then of course we had that like death spiral that took place also. And so that's actually a degree of political violence also. So we're just coming out, I think. I don't know that we're really awake to what's happening. And I think that Professor Anderson hits the nail on the head when she says there's got to be consequences. Where are the consequences? Where's the accountability? You know, the Bar Association, we have to strip the licenses of these attorneys that dared to take the cases on election eve, right? That had no evidence of that and just drummed up this misinformation campaign that people are now feeding into. It can't be simply an excuse that they're introducing these voter suppression laws under this like ambiguous concept of public confidence in the election system, because you created the public lack of confidence in the election system. So absolutely, we need to have this accountability. We need people to lose their licenses. We need people to go to jail. We need people to be, you know, you can't just storm. You know, it's really remarkable. I was doing legal observation with my green hat in Washington, D.C., the first day of the Trump inauguration. And there was a mass arrest that took place. I don't know if people realize over 200 people were mass arrested and threatened with 65 years in jail under this crazy notion of conspiracy, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm not making an exaggeration. This happened, and they were, they had to be dragged into court. They had to go under this ongoing prosecution simply because they were participating in the right to dissent. And I don't see that type of response to these individuals that, stormed the Capitol, right? Like they threatened death of our elected representatives. I mean, I think we need to wake up. I think we need to really wake up. And the thing is that it is our elected representatives. Jamie Raskin is doing such a wonderful job. He's really, the leadership is really incredible right now, but we need the people to be moving on this, right? Like they need to be hearing from us, and we all need to wake up, because it's true. We're just going to continue to have this cycle. How do we get through this, right? How do we, as Arundhati Roy said, how can we use the pandemic as a portal and get to the point of election modernization, to get to the point of democracy through this crisis, instead of fall back on the status quo and kind of lull back to sleep? I think that's really the challenge ahead of us.
Okay, let me see if we have some questions coming from the audience now. And we're still trying to figure out how we're supposed to retrieve those questions. We know they're out there. Let's see here. Are we receiving them on the same format? Oh gosh. Somebody's gonna have to send us a smoke signal, because
They are in the chat. There are a good number of them in the chat box.
Okay, well, I wish we could get to that here.
I can read them to you if you want.
Okay, I see a little chat there. Oh boy, the print is tiny. Yes, go ahead, go right ahead, Professor.
No. From Claudia Withers, what is the role of the media in assessing the challenges to voting rights that the panel describes? Is there too much whataboutism?
Who wants to tackle that first?
I think that part of what we're seeing is a media model that is the clickbait model, and that is the race. It's a race. So for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, it was a failure for the Democrats and it was a win for the Republicans, but not that it was a failure for American democracy. And so it is the framing of what these battles are, that when the framing is this horse race thing, instead of American democracy is losing, the people are losing, the citizens are not having access to the ballot box, then when we don't get that framing and we get that it is just these voting rights battles are partisan battles, that is part of the danger that is out there. It is the unwillingness to accept what is really going on. And I really believe that part of what we're seeing is the drug of American exceptionalism, the kind of sense that, oh, this democracy has been here for years. It's the world's longest democracy. It's the world's greatest democracy. And yes, we've had a couple of blips, but this thing can't turn into what has happened in these other places because we're America. And yes, it can happen here. And we need the media to be very clear. It is happening here.
It's another way of looking at that point, Yael, you made earlier about privilege. There's an assumption that people feel like, no, this is just a moment. Surely we're going to get back to normal, and our normal, what we know is things are going to stay together. We're going to all hold it together, but it's very fragile. And I think what we've seen in recent months and years, I mean, it hasn't been long, right, to see the fragility of democracy in this nation. You got another question there, Professor?
I do indeed.
Okay.
There's a question: how do people in blue states help secure voting rights for people in other areas? I'm not sure if that's a blue state versus red state. How do people in blue states help secure voting rights protection for people in other areas, presumably red states?
Yeah. So Carol, what do you want people like me in Massachusetts do to help out people in Georgia?
Send money. um, and also to really help with the framing of the narrative. Because part of what is so powerful and corrosive is that these ideas of voter suppression eddy up all throughout the United States. I mean, so it is what Yael was talking about in terms of the blockage in New York, in terms of some just basic access to the ballot box. So it's you fighting for it there helps us fight for it here.
Help me understand what you mean when you say send money. I mean, where does that money go? What does that help finance?
Thank you. It goes to the organizations that are on the ground, who are working in these communities, who are working in the Latino communities, who are working in the Asian American communities, who are working in the Hispanic communities, who are working in the Black communities, who are working in the rural areas and in the urban areas, who are knocking on doors, who are sitting down meeting with folks. I mean, this is labor intensive work, and it is necessary work. It is the work of democracy. It is not free. And the other side has big dark money writing huge checks. We need to balance that off there are more people than there are money, there is money. When you get enough people voting, you can in fact begin to change the narratives and the policies in this nation.
And just to break it down even further, because I think a lot of times as soon as they hear dollar signs, they glaze over. So it may not necessarily mean paying for people's paychecks, because a lot of people are volunteering. You're talking about the money is then transferable to resources like gas. How do you get there? How do you get to knock on someone's door, if not to get there, whether it's the bus, public transportation, or gas money? Can you break it down even further for people to understand? When they hear money, they might freak out a little bit and thinking it's lining somebody's pockets, but help people understand.
Folks aren't living large. Folks are doing the work. So Georgia has 159 counties. To be able to set up and operate in those 159 counties, you need to know where people are. You need to know where they live. You need to know if they have voted regularly or not. You need to know all of this stuff when you begin knocking on their doors and talking with them. You need to be able to get there. You need to have, you need to be able, when folks are working all day, they need to be able to eat. I mean, it's a little thing, but it's a big thing. It's the kinds of basic structures of being able to organize and do the work. When you think about the civil rights movement, we herald that as this great moment where the United States had its come to Jesus meeting. That took money. That took money for the structures where they slept. It took money for being able to drive around Mississippi. It took money to be able to do that. None of this is free. Democracy is not free.
Professor, probably, I'm looking at the clock, maybe you have time for maybe three?
I think there's time for just one more question, which is, how do we move young people from protests to the polls? How do we move young people from protests to the polls? I take it that's a question about how to activists to vote.
Well, I mean, I don't think there's a single unique path, but I think what I would say is that personally, in terms of my path, I think the best way to do that is helping young people to feel empowered in the communities that they're working in. So I think for me, a big part was feeling empowered on my campus in order to make changes in terms of getting a early voting site on campus or getting election day off. Those were the things that made me feel power. And I think with young people in particular, we're fighting against, and I want to distinguish this from apathy. I think we're fighting against this idea that I've been hurt so much institutionally and systemically by these systems that I'm just so hurt and traumatized by it, but I can't do anything more. And so by helping people feel empowered, and by that, I mean sort of working in your own local communities in terms of working maybe with your local BOE or working on a state level campaign. I'll give an example of one campaign that my organization, our organization, Jim Vote, is doing. We're running this program called Ascenders, and in this program, we're putting young people on Secretary of State elections across the country. And so things like that give young people the opportunity to actually gain experience and to not just be like, because we always hear, go vote, go vote, go vote. But then by actually like working on these campaigns, you can actually like learn why it's important, and you can really feel your impact. And I think that's what young people need, to feel like their voice truly like matters and that they have an opportunity for impact.
Can I ask a question, Hamilton? Talking to friends of mine who are working on youth movements and, on this protest of voting, my friend is finding one framing that really, it's not protest or voting. Like in an earlier age, we thought, well, there's people who work the outside game and then there's inside system people who vote. She says, no, it's like protest and voting. So if you're working on climate or any of these or guns or any of those other issues, like if you're an activist, like 95% of your effort is on the outside game where it should be, but it's not that hard to go vote. And it probably help, maybe 0.5%. So why not do that too? So protest and voting, maybe, does that fit, or does that think, no, that's not the right way to think?
No, I totally think that fits. And I mean, especially, as we're thinking about, trying to make voting rights a mass movement, especially for young people, that's absolutely necessary in terms of linking voting rights to other movements that young people are really, really engaged in. So I absolutely agree.
Fantastic. Well, I mean, this has been an incredibly enriching hour. Thank you so much for everyone's input. I hope, Professor Brooks, this equips a lot of people who are listening and watching with perhaps some new tools on how to secure our voting rights in America, and perhaps new ideas on how to combat any other obstructions that are coming our way, because we know we have not seen it all. And let's hope at the very least it'll inspire people to vote like they've never done before.
So if I could just lift up a word of appreciation to the moderator and to all of you as panelists. There are a great many things that we will discuss over the course of these 2 days, but this is the most important, because obviously voting rights is foundational for all of the issues that we are working on. And one of the things that Yael reminded me of that I think is particularly relevant for this panel, the advocacy for the youth vote goes back to World War II, with the notion being that if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to be able to vote. And so certainly that was true of World War II veterans, young men, and Vietnam veterans, young men. But in this moment, the people who are taking the most risk in our democracy and who are fighting the hardest oftentimes in our democracy are young people on the front lines of social justice. So if they're old enough to fight in terms of activism, it should be that we are old enough, mature enough to secure their right to vote, along with the other kinds of democratic rights and privileges that we've discussed on this panel. So we're just extraordinarily grateful for your expertise, for your experience. And Fredricka, to your point about education, the whole point of this convening, right, is to equip activists and advocates with real tools, right? So in other words, talking about voting rights, leveraging the scholarship of Yael and Carol and Archon, but also leveraging the expertise of activists in this moment, so that they're able to engage in what we call multilingual advocacy, law, policy, economics, morality, ethics, multi-level, different levels, state, federal, local, and multi-generational. And I think we saw some of that on this panel. So we are deeply, deeply grateful. Thank you for your work, and we look forward to seeing you in the work of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Yay.
Thank you so much, Fredricka.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
So we are looking in our afternoon session. We have 2 in-person sessions and 2 remote sessions. So just as by way of reminder, we have a session beginning at 1 o'clock, 2 in person, 2 remote. And these are advocacy skills building workshops, one of which is called Lift Every Voice Using Media to Amplify the Movement. Using media to amplify the movement, that is to say, lift every voice. And that will be a session at 1 o'clock, and that will be here on the campus of Harvard. And then at 2 o'clock, we have Funding the Unpopular to Defeat the Unjust. Funding the Unpopular to Defeat the Unjust. And we have that session beginning at 2:30. So we're asking everyone to come back for the session at 1 o'clock and to take a moment to have lunch, but be sure to rejoin us. And you can view this convening, of course, on Hoover, but also on Facebook, also on Twitter, and certainly YouTube. So please continue to celebrate with us the legacy of William Monroe Trotter and continue to learn and study about the ways in which we can fund our movements, communicate about our movements, and do the work in this time. And let me also note that in the afternoon at 4 o'clock, we will have a book talk from Carrie Greenwich on the life of William Monroe Trotter. So, and let me, colleagues, before you sign off for lunch, I just want you to just hold on for just one moment. You recall back in 1914, William Monroe Trotter goes to the White House with a group of Black advocates and activists. They meet with the President of the United States, President Woodrow Wilson. In the course of this meeting, William Monroe Trotter confronts President Wilson over his unwillingness to stop the segregation of the federal workforce. He confronts President Woodrow Wilson. President Woodrow Wilson tries initially to sidestep the questions, to avoid the issue, to duck the issue. But William Monroe Trotter confronts the president so much so severely, if you will, that the President of the United States says that he takes offense and finds offensive the tone of Trotter. Trotter is promptly kicked out of the White House and in fact banned from the White House. And so in this moment, in 2022, we have Ambassador Mark Green, who is the CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is a federally established center for scholars studying international relations and diplomacy and diplomatic service. And so we have a video from the CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center speaking to the legacy of President Woodrow Wilson and the legacy of William Monroe Trotter. This is well worth watching. Take a look at this video and we will certainly see you at 1. But please hold on and take note of this video with these words from Ambassador Green.
Hello everyone, I'm Ambassador Mark Green, President and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Congress first established the Wilson Center in 1968 as a memorial to America's 28th president. Since then, in line with that charter, the center has explored in depth Wilson's legacy as a statesman and foreign policy visionary. But of course, there's another side to his legacy, a side that I promised we'd be more open about when I joined the center last year. no real analysis of President Wilson is honest if it doesn't confront his record of racism. So we're working to highlight the life and leadership of William Monroe Trotter, both to honor an important figure in the American Civil Rights Movement and examine the racism of our 28th president and his times. Before becoming president, Wilson expressed racist beliefs during his scholarly career, minimizing the evils of slavery and criticizing the architects of Reconstruction. As U.S. president, Wilson was too slow to condemn the epidemic of lynching that raged across the South. He also appointed several segregationists to senior positions in the government. Perhaps most notably, Wilson presided over the expanded segregation of the federal service. That involved separating federal employees by race, firing numerous black officials, and restricting black people's opportunities for employment and advancement. These policies served to reinforce the rising tide of Jim Crow laws in the South. They also cemented inequality in the nation's capital, which was at the time home to a thriving black middle class. In 1914, Trotter courageously confronted Wilson right in the White House and denounced permitting segregation of the federal workforce as a humiliation. Wilson responded by defending his policies as preventing racial friction. He declared himself offended by Trotter's tone and ejected Trotter from the White House. This confrontation was historically significant because it featured two important figures in American history arguing over two very different views of what was right. History tells us Woodrow Wilson was ahead of his time in speaking to human and political rights in the international realm. Toward the end of World War I, he was an outspoken proponent of self-determination, and he was a lead architect of the League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN. History also tells us that in other ways, darker ways, he wasn't ahead of his time. Instead, he was riddled with contradictions and, yes, racism. And that confrontation with Trotter was an important moment that exposed Wilson's hypocrisy and America's. Of course, Trotter's legacy is about much more than Woodrow Wilson. Trotter spent his life pursuing the cause of civil rights and equality. Until his death in 1934, Trotter fought for the equal treatment of African American soldiers, presented demands for civil rights in France after World War I, and fought for federal anti-lynching legislation. Like Wilson in trying to get the U.S. to join the League of Nations, Trotter ultimately died disappointed, his cause unfulfilled. But Trotter's victory was merely deferred. To this day, we continue to work towards the same ideals that he espoused, and generation after generation, his legacy continues to drive us. Just last month, President Biden signed the Emmett Till law, making lynching a federal crime. Last year, the Wilson Center established the William Monroe Trotter Leadership Award to symbolically reject Wilson's legacy of racism and segregation. This award recognizes those who have brought diversity to our foreign policy community and helped to extend American foreign policy and national security leadership. This award is meant to remind us that true visionary leadership, like that of William Monroe Trotter, doesn't always result in change right away. It may take years or even lifetimes, but change comes eventually due to the hard work of people like William Monroe Trotter and the ideals he espoused, like his personal motto, "For every right, with all thy might." I would like to thank the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice, especially Professor Cornell Brooks, for the leadership and partnership on these issues. Their work continues to espouse the ideals, energy, and commitment that Trotter's legacy demands. It is an honor to work with you, and thank you so much for including me in this historic event.